Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Learn Arena podcast. I am Trey Goff, and with me is Gabriel Mitchell. We both work at Learn Arena, an online competitive e-learning platform. And today we are going to be discussing and overviewing one of the courses that we have on Learn Arena so that you guys can hopefully leave this with at least a little inkling of what it is we do and learn a little bit from us about economics. So we're going to discuss the economics course today.
Yes. So lately, my girlfriend actually has started taking your course. Now, she's someone who her passion has been more in things like yoga and learning about animals. And so economics is totally 100% foreign to her. It's a totally new way of thinking. And this is something she brought up to me, was that taking a lot of our courses, but especially the economics course, has encouraged her to just think about the world in a different, unique way. And I kind of just want to ask you, what do you think it is about economics that's doing that specifically?
Yeah, I'm very glad you asked that because I start the course off with describing kind of the economic way of thinking. So for context, I should have said this at the outset, I wrote the economics course. I have a bachelor's degree in economics. I have written books with academic professors and professors of economics. I have some peer-reviewed economics papers that have been published in academic journals. So I have a bit of a good background in the kind of intellectual side of economics. The reason economics is not just like the study of dollars and cents, right? It's not the study of financial transactions. It's not the study of Wall Street. A lot of people, when they think of economics, they think of Wall Street traders, hedge funds, supply and demand graphs, charts, math, that sort of stuff. The core distinction I want to make here, and the real lesson of economics, is that economics is the study of human action, as one of the greatest economists of all time, Ludwig von Mises, said. If I had to summarize the study of economics in a sentence, it is simply the study of human action. And what economics gives you, more than anything else, especially at this introductory level, is a new way of looking at and thinking about the world. It gives you new mental models. If you think of the way you think about the world as kind of a toolkit, right? You have a toolkit of mental models, of concepts, of analogies that you use to try to understand and reason about the world. Economics has a whole suite of new tools for you to add to your mental model tool set effectively. And because these tools apply to the scope of human action, which is basically anything and everything humans do at scale or on an individual level, understanding these concepts deeply radically changes the tools you have at your disposal to look at and think about the world. If you don't mind, I'll go dive into one kind of concrete example of this because this sounds quite abstract, right? One of the core concepts in economics, and we start the course off talking about this, is the concept of opportunity costs, okay? All opportunity cost is referring to is when you make a decision, a choice between two things, whether it be an action, a purchase, a strategic decision, a life decision, whatever. It doesn't have to involve money at all, by the way. You are deciding between that choice, whatever choice you're making, and the opportunity cost of that choice, which is the value of the next best foregone option you could have chosen, right? So as a very simple example, if I am choosing what to drink right now and my choices are coffee and water, if I select coffee, the opportunity cost of that choice is the value of the water to me, the satiation that might have brought, the taste that might have brought, whatever the case may be. Now this scales up to anything and everything in life. This mental tool, this concept of opportunity cost, applies to the most profound decisions you'll make in life, utterly divorced from dollars and cents, right? Like who to marry is a great example of this. You can apply this economic way of thinking, the concept of opportunity cost, to who to marry. So if you're dating someone, you've been dating them seriously, and you're trying to decide if you want to take that next step in your relationship, then you have to think about the opportunity cost of doing so. The opportunity cost is the next best option you could choose, which in this case maybe is being single. So you have to think through, okay, if I choose to get married, what am I giving up? I'm giving up being single. I'm giving up some flexibility. I'm giving up the potential for finding another potentially better life partner, right? So this tool of opportunity cost helps you think very clearly about the trade-offs with each decision. There's a sub-point here, which is that every single decision has a trade-off. There's this classic cliche in economics, right? And the cliche is there's no such thing as a free lunch. All that cliche means, to translate it a little bit in more practical terms, is every single choice has an opportunity cost, no matter what it is. They are utterly inescapable. There is no such thing as a free lunch, a choice where there is no opportunity cost. Now, it may be that there is one choice that is abundantly, obviously, leagues and orders of magnitude better than the other choices, but there's still an opportunity cost to that choice, right? So, for example, if you win the lottery and it's $1 billion, a ton of money, and you're trying to choose, your choice is, do I take the lottery or not? Do I claim this lottery ticket or not? While that may seem like a free lunch, it's not. There's still a trade-off there. Your life is going to radically change after you get that $1 billion. So you need to think about, what am I giving up as a choice of getting this, right? I'm giving up my existing career aspirations. I'm giving up my current way of life. I'm giving up probably my local or current social groups. I'm giving up the current social dynamics among that group as everyone becomes aware that I'm now absurdly rich. My point there just being, everything has an opportunity cost and everything has a trade-off. So this is one simple example of a tool of thought, a concept from economics that can radically transform your day-to-day life, literally how you make decisions about what you're going to do.
It's powerful stuff, man. I've definitely felt that impact in my own life. There's such a huge difference between the type of person who's living very accidentally, very reflexively, versus the type of person who's trying to be very conscious and think through their decisions. And so I can certainly attest that economics has had a huge impact on my own life, even beyond my political convictions, just in the day to day. And I think that's really powerful. So what do you think, we've built this course. Why do you think someone should take this course versus, say, some other online course? What makes this course unique? What's the structure that it has? What makes this course special?
Absolutely. Most other courses that you'll find online, including other YouTube videos, often do not start with the foundational concepts that are at the root of economics. They kind of dive straight into the middle. They go straight into supply and demand, explaining why the curves have the slope they do, how supply curves react to supply shocks, how to use marginal utility equations to calculate where you land on what the intersection point, the equilibrium point on a demand curve and a supply curve is, where they meet, what the market clearing price is. And don't worry about kind of understanding those things right now. My point is just that most other courses don't start with these foundational concepts I was just alluding to. I wrote our economics course such that by the time you're done with it, you won't have some kind of useless information or barely useful information. You instead come away from the course with concrete, useful mental models and concepts for you to not only make decisions about and reason about your personal life, but to also understand macroeconomic problems in public policy. Economics and public policy, meaning like governance, right? Laws, rules, regulations are inextricably intertwined. And it's very hard to reason about public policy without at least a basic understanding of these foundational concepts of economics. And unfortunately, most other courses, this is a problem I had even in college, actually, Gabriel. So I had a degree in economics, right? I took dozens of economics courses. And I didn't encounter these foundational concepts I'm describing, like opportunity costs, trade-offs, and marginal utility. I encountered those in my second year of college in a book club with some economics professors that I had befriended, where we were just reading academic books and discussing them week to week, completely outside of class and an external thing I was pursuing. That's because even university classes in this, you often won't get to some of these concepts until you get to like intermediate microeconomics or intermediate macroeconomics or economic theory, right? And that's a problem, because if you don't understand these basic concepts of opportunity cost, of supply and demand, of marginal utility, of diminishing marginal utility, the rest of economics doesn't really make that much sense. So our course, I would highly encourage everyone to take our course. And even if you're not on LearnArena, you don't want to take the course, you're starting your study of economics, you should start with these foundational concepts and then move forward from there, right? It's important to lay that foundation, and it makes it much easier to learn the more complicated stuff where everyone else starts, like utility functions and like supply and demand curves.
John Maynard Keynes, who is one of the thinkers mentioned in the course, he has this quote I've always really liked that's practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Of course, from our worldview, he might be that defunct economist, but it really emphasizes how foundational economics is to political philosophy and political ideas. And it's so curious to me how confident people are about certain convictions, political convictions, whether it's about minimum wage or whatever. They're very confident while not understanding even basic supply and demand, let alone the foundational things about opportunity cost. I recall hearing a story a while back where I was working with some academics, some professors, and they were talking about how they're in some committee thinking about budgets. And for whatever reason, because there was no economist in the room, no one was acknowledging opportunity cost. No one was acknowledging that the budget had a limit. No one could conceive of the idea that if I put $1 into increasing teacher salary, that's a dollar that could have gone to funding some low-income student's education journey. And it was such a strange, real, surreal realization that economics is basically everything, and yet very, very few people understand even the basic foundations.
Yeah, there is this unfortunate side effect of learning the basics of economics that I'll go ahead and warn each of you about. That side effect is once you learn these basic foundations, you're going to become incredibly disillusioned by American politics or any politics in any country, because you'll see politicians, senators, even presidents making just very basic, elementary, fundamental mistakes when reasoning about a specific public policy because they don't understand these concepts of incentives, the concept of marginal utility, the concept of trade-offs, the concept of opportunity costs. They reason from this kind of almost emotional place without thinking through the second and third order ramifications of a decision. So there's one other kind of foundational economic concept. And even just listening to this podcast, I hope even if you don't take the course, you'll actually get an inkling of some of these concepts that will help you in life. Another one we haven't mentioned yet that comes up often is incentives, right? So the basic premise is human beings are rational actors that respond to incentives, right? They are rationally self-interested, which is a technical term in economics. All that really means is they are going to make the best decision for them and furthering their specific goals, whatever that specific goal is, and economics doesn't care what your goal is, based on the incentives created by their environment, right? They will be incented to do certain things based on the institutional, political, or economic and fiscal, financial environment, right? So to give you like a very concrete example, this one happens all the time. You will see politicians, you can go on Twitter or YouTube right now and look up a politician talking about this, and what I'm about to tell you, and see them committing this same mistake. You'll see politicians say things like, we need more clean energy in the United States, carbon neutral or carbon negative even energy sources, okay? So we should subsidize it. Subsidize it just means the government, is the we here, the government should allocate funds to producing clean energy. So we should subsidize, the government should fund the building of solar plants or wind farms, right? And that's where the reasoning stops. They don't think, A, what is the next best marginal use of those subsidies? What else could we be doing in American society? I'm focusing on America here because we're Americans. What else could they be doing in American society with those budget dollars instead of funding projects, right? Instead of funding solar projects or wind projects. They also don't think about how this incentivizes entrepreneurs, right, to go try to start some of these solar projects instead of whatever the next best use of their time is. This is called the crowding out effect, where when the government funds something, they crowd out other activity around that thing, and they incentivize entrepreneurs to focus on that thing relative to someone else. And this is critical because you'll see them discussing this, and you'll be thinking to yourself, well, wait a second. If we are throwing money if the government is subsidizing solar farms, well, won't that incentivize maybe bad actors or people who don't have the country's best interest at heart to just go try to start building solar farms, even if that might not be what their best skill set would have been because the government is funding it? So then you have what one of our favorite economists, Frederic Bastiat, calls the seen and the unseen, right? You have the seen consequence of funding, subsidizing solar farms, which is like, hey, a new solar farm got built. The unseen opportunity cost of that is the next best project that entrepreneur might have built instead of a solar farm. And it also does not show that this might attract and incentivize people who are bad actors to try to take advantage of those subsidies. And if you think I'm lying about this, I encourage you to just Google the term Solyndra. This exact thing happened. These clean energy subsidies happened during the Obama administration. And there was a huge boondoggle to the tune of a couple $2 billion because this company, Solyndra, had a terrible financial model. It was terribly mismanaged, but they were able to receive billions of dollars in subsidies from the government to create a solar farm that ultimately failed. They did not manufacture a solar panel. It ended up failing completely and was a big scandal during the Obama administration. All of which is easily foreseeable if you simply think about the concepts of incentives and the concept of opportunity cost and the concept of the seen and the unseen. So these are very basic foundational concepts. You don't need any math to understand this. This is another common misconception that economics is all math. Academic economics is a lot of math, but the basic concepts that you and I as normal lay people need to understand and reason about the world don't require any math. They just require clear thought and understanding these concepts and building these concepts and these tools into your mental toolkit.
Yeah, you said something in the beginning there that I think that struck me as something that's important but sometimes confusing to listeners and people who are trying to get in economics. And that was the use of rational. And you offer an explanation, but I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into that because one of the first foundational critiques of economics in general, people who critique economics as a concept, is I've heard people say, well, economists think everyone's rational. And in their mind, they hear this word rational, and they think economists are saying everyone is smart, everyone is doing research. But that's not what we mean. When an economist or someone who's interested in the topic is using the word rational, specifically we're saying humans have goal-oriented behavior. Humans make actions that can be retroactively explained by reasons. They might be wrong. This is an important distinction. They might be wrong. They might be mistaken. They might be irrational in the common sense of the term. But when we say rational, we just mean there's goal-oriented behavior that has explanations through the lens of incentives. And that's pretty much it. And using that model, not only can you explain why subsidies lead to certain malinvestments, you can also understand why your girlfriend acted a certain way, or why your friend at work acted a certain way, right? They had goals in mind, sometimes subconsciously, but they had goals that motivated their actions. They had incentives that motivated their actions. It's so powerful, and it really not only gives you a lens to understand kind of the macro political world, but can even help you understand that more micro personal relationships sometimes.
That's exactly right. I'll take a fun culture war example of this, okay? Which is the current dating market, right? So Gabriel very astutely said what we mean by rational behavior is not like, oh, they're definitely making the right decision and did all the research. It's a very different point. People, current kind of manosphere and right-wing commentators love to say like, oh, modern women are too picky on dating apps. There's some data out there that corroborates this, right? Women on average get about 10 times the number of right swipes, which means people are trying to match with them, than men do. As a result of that, women do not swipe right very often. So you might think, and the common manosphere explanation for this is like, oh, women are too picky, they've raised their standards too high, blah, 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 whatever. All of that is wrong. Women are making the rational decision with the information and incentives presented to them to be pickier because they have a greater number of options of matches to choose from. So they, by definition, have to be more selective. If they just accepted just your normal woman, right, not a supermodel, just a normal, like conventionally attractive woman, if they accepted every right swipe from guys that swipe right on them, they're going to be going on 4 dates a day with 4 different men a day. And that's completely untenable and is even counterproductive to their end goal. And with their end goal there being find a good partner, right? Find someone to spend the rest of their life with. So this idea, right, that women are being too picky or dating apps are skewed against men, or you'll see a bunch of crazy commentary around this, can be very simply explained by using the economic way of thinking. By thinking, okay, women have a rational goal in mind. What is that rational goal and what incentives do they face when using dating apps, for example, to make decisions about who it is they're going to match with? Now, this brings me to another point, which I want to bring up a little bit, Gabriel, and I'm actually going to let you kind of explain this a little bit because it quite nicely ties into your ethics course as well, which is that a common misconception is that economics is inherently right-wing, right? Economics is inherently free market. Economics is inherently whatever. It inherently has kind of an economic bent, a ideological or political bent, right? This could not be further from the truth. Economics is what's called a positive science, which very simply just means it is a study of the world as it is, right? This is juxtaposed to a normative science. So a normative claim is a claim about something that is kind of like an opinion or a claim about it that is not directly related to the facts. As a very small example, and then I'm going to turn it over to Gabriel to expound upon this a bit, a positive claim by me, right, would be that Gabriel's wallpaper behind him is white, right? That's a positive claim. A normative claim would be Gabriel's white wallpaper is bland, or Gabriel's white wallpaper is pretty. It doesn't matter which direction the claim is in. It is a normative claim, a statement of value, of a value judgment, and this is critical. A normative claim is a value judgment claim about something. This is a huge problem in economics because people will often read a positive economic finding and immediately impute a normative value judgment on that claim when none is meant. It's simply a factual claim. Let me give you a concrete example of this, and then I'm going to turn it over to Gabriel. There's been a bunch of peer-reviewed academic economics papers that find over and over again that jurisdictions, governments, both at the state and country level, that have more economic freedom as measured by an objective economic freedom index that uses a bunch of math to determine kind of how economically free or not a jurisdiction is. Those jurisdictions, on average, have higher rates of entrepreneurship, higher rates of GDP growth, etc., right? This is just a raw statistical finding. This is a positive fact. It's a fact of correlation. These papers don't even establish a causal link because that's very hard to do for reasons we can get into. When me and Gabriel do an episode on epistemology, we'll explain why. But just bucket that in your mind for now. And so people will hear that and automatically say, oh, see, economics is right-wing. They're claiming we should have more free markets and more economic freedom. At no point was that claimed in that statement. The statement is simply a positive statement of, hey, there is a mathematical correlation between economic freedom and GDP growth. It is a value judgment to then take the leap and say, and therefore, we should have more economically free policies to drive GDP growth. Because you're imputing a value in there. You're saying, I value GDP growth, therefore, I'm going to use the evidence presented here, this positive statement, to justify this normative value judgment claim. That's where this confusion comes from. So, Gabriel, I'd love to hear you kind of expound upon this a little bit as well.
Yeah, that positive normative distinction is really important, so I'm going to reiterate an example. If I said minimum wage laws cause unemployment, that is purely a positive claim. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying a sort of statistical fact. And you may disagree with that statistical fact, but the point is I'm just making a sort of positive claim. Or on the other hand, if I say, therefore, governments should not have minimum wage, or that unemployment doesn't matter, minimum wage is still good, right? Those are sort of normative claims. So there's a big distinction here. The economist Ludwig von Mises, who you were mentioned before, he is credited of making the claim that he believed that economics should be what he called valueless, which is essentially saying that economics should be purely a positive sort of exploration. Now, that does mean that if you want to reach meaningful conclusions doing economics, not just conclusions, but if you want to use your economic knowledge to advocate for things, you need to expand beyond economics. You need to do political philosophy, you need to study ethics, you need to think about these things. Because it may be the case that you may reach the definitive, objective, positive conclusion that minimum wage increases unemployment. But how you interpret that, and whether or not that is a cost that's worth some of the other benefits that might theoretically come from minimum wage, is a matter of philosophical exploration, right? That's where you need ethics and political philosophy. And so, yeah, what you're saying is just really, really, really powerful. That distinction, I think, is just extremely helpful. And if you want to study economics, you have to go into it understanding that while the things you're studying have political implications, that does not mean that those things are themselves political, or that the implied implications are a necessary component of what you're studying. It's totally separate, and if you want to be a good economist, you really have to think through that.
Yep.
I will say one challenge to studying economics, though, is that there's all these different schools of thought. Right, there's the Marxists and the Austrians and the Chicagos. And I wonder if one of the reasons people have this external perception of economics being very political is because all these schools of thoughts have their debates, right? Marxists have a certain theory of value that leads to certain conclusions about how the world works, which is different than the way, say, the Chicago school thinks about value and thinks about these conclusions. And I wonder if that's part of the problem, is that economics leads to facts that may have implications, and so political philosophers are combining their economic ideas with their political philosophy, and then sometimes even labeling that as economics. Or if it's not clear to the layman audience, they maybe get confused about what's doing politics and what's doing economics.
That's exactly right. So I'm going to both respond to that and continue to expound upon one of your examples to explain why this gets really confusing really fast. So I think there's two reasons that so many people, because the vast majority of people that kind of even brush up against economics almost immediately run into this ideological problem. And the reason for that is because economics is not like physics, unfortunately. Now, both fields are positive fields, meaning they are just a kind of accumulating facts and studying the way the world is as an objective fact, right? But economics in particular, unlike physics, does not have kind of very many, it has a few, but it does not have very many hard and fast findings that every economist from across the economic schools of thought, across all economic schools of thought, agree on. That's the problem. The problem is because economics is a study of human action is incredibly complicated, multivariate, and in some cases arbitrary. So you end up with this unfortunate problem, which is that a lot of economists tend to focus on particular areas of economics, particular subfields, particular specific subject areas, and in so doing, end up with kind of different ways to think about the world, different models to think about the world. Now, there are some findings in economics that function like physics, right? So in physics, we say, all right, there is a c, the speed of light, the constant, right? Every single physicist, no matter what field of study they are focused on, no matter what kind of school of thought they adhere to in physics, they all agree exactly what the speed of light is, like 9.8 times 10 to the 8th squared or something like that. They all agree that what the c constant is, right? That is not up for debate because it has been experimentally proven using the scientific method over and over and over and over again. They can do what are called controlled experiments to test this, right? They can isolate what I mean by controlled experiment, right, is they can isolate every single other variable away from the speed of light and just measure the speed of light in a variety of different ways and do this over and over again, getting the same exact result every time. The problem is you cannot do the same kind of controlled experiment in economics. This again goes back to epistemology, so I'll bracket this discussion just a little bit and not dive too deep into it. But the point here is just there are different schools of thought because we can't do repeated experiments on the same thing. Let's take an example. I'm going to run with the minimum wage again. This is purely hypothetical, okay? But you could have a study that does a randomized controlled trial, which is like the gold standard across social sciences, and say, all right, we're going to take this city of 10,000 people, and we're going to give half of the people, we're going to apply the minimum wage to them at random, and the other half, we're going to not have a minimum wage at random. Then let's study what happens from that, right? Let's study exactly how that economy grows, if unemployment increases or decreases, if entrepreneurship increases or decreases, et cetera, right? And you get a set of findings from that. What you can't do, and what physics can do, is run that same experiment again, because it's going to be different people at different ages with different jobs. Even if it's the same town and you run the same experiment the very next year, circumstances have changed, right? It's not a controlled experiment because you cannot control every single variable. You can't roll the kind of synopsis way I would put this. In economics, you can't run an experiment, roll the clock back, and run that exact identical experiment again with the exact same people in the exact same circumstances. It's physically impossible. So because of that, economics has a much harder time establishing causality and establishing specific hard and fast rules for things the same way, say, economics does. So that's the first thing. I think that's at the root, Gabriel, of the answer to your question of why there are different schools of thought, why this gets confusing. Now, there's another reason this gets confusing. And economists, this is an entirely self-inflicted wound by economists, one of which I am guilty and every single other economist is guilty, which is economists will take their empirical findings, the positive findings that they have, and do public advocacy and write books and go on TV shows and take government jobs where they advocate for specific normative public policies, right? Every single economist does this, and this is why this gets confusing, because you'll have economists like Robert Reich, who is one of my least favorite economists on earth, who will make wild claims about wealth accumulation, about inequality, about the minimum wage, etc. And you, as a casual observer, are like, well, he's an economist, and he's stating these things as if they're fact, therefore they must be fact. The problem is what he's not telling you is those are all value judgments. Those are normative interpretations of existing empirical literature, of existing kind of positive findings. And this problem is compounded because the minimum wage debate is a perfect example. There are a ton of empirical papers trying to study the effect of the minimum wage, but because of that lack of the ability to run exactly identical trials, like I described earlier, exactly identical experiments, these papers have wildly conflicting results. If you go to Google Scholar right now and look up minimum wage, there are tens of thousands of papers about the minimum wage, and you will find papers that say everything from the minimum wage will destroy your economy and cause massive unemployment, all the way to the minimum wage has zero downsides. It actually increases employment and increases entrepreneurship and has no negative effects whatsoever. Again, because each of these studies has a different experimental design. Each study is done in a different population, in a different place, at a different time, with a different labor and capital structure. And because of that, you end up with wildly conflicting results. So this can get a little hairy. in terms of trying to find like ground truth on controversial issues. And the bottom line is, a lot of economists overstate how much we know in the field of economics. They will present a lot of these things as like hard and fast facts in the same style that a physicist might say the speed of light is x, is that 9.8 number. And that's just simply not the case because, again, we cannot run repeated, controlled experiments. I think that's at the root of the issue. But to recap for you briefly, the lack of the ability to run repeated, controlled experiments means there are no hard and fast, universally agreed upon positive claims in economics. Not no, but there's very few. And that economists often do public policy advocacy, which deeply muddies the waters for anyone who, as a layman, is just trying to understand economics, because it is very hard to separate out when an economist is talking about something, whether or not they are talking about something that has strong empirical foundations in the research literature, or whether or not they're going out on a limb and stating their own interpretation and a normative judgment of that literature. So they shoot themselves in the foot there. So economists wading into the debate is the problem, and the lack of repeatable experiments is the other problem.
Yeah, it's a really challenging field to study for those reasons, right? Like the way in which you're trained to understand a science as you're going through school is so foundationally different than the way you need to deal with social science, and especially specifically the social science of economics. It's just so unique. And as you mentioned, as a result of some of these challenges, there's all these different branches of economics that have, starting from these different epistemological, sometimes even different metaphysical foundations that are leading to conclusions about value and about social structures and about how money moves and what interest rates and how interest rates affect things. And so maybe one way we can transition this conversation is just talking about a few of those differences, perhaps maybe value theory or something along those lines, and seeing how different economists and schools of thought think about these questions and how their foundational principles lead to much bigger, broader conclusion differences.
Absolutely. I think that's a great direction to take the conversation, Gabriel. So I'll do this historically in a kind of a chronological fashion. The entire field of economics is fairly new, which is another part of this problem, by the way. The study of physics has been around since Aristotle. The study of economics has been around since roughly 1776 in Adam Smith's publication of The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith is often referred to as the father of economics because he was the first person to write about the field in a systematic way. He kind of birthed the field of the study of economics as a whole. And he belongs to what's called the classical school of economics. Classical, obviously, because it was kind of the first generation, and we've learned a lot since then. And what the classical economists believed, in particular, which shapes basically every economic finding in every economic field thereafter, classical economists believed in something called the labor theory of value. Now, the only modern school that still also believes in the labor theory of value is the Marxist school of thought, which I almost didn't even include in the course because it's actually not really a recognized field of economics anymore because it has been kind of so thoroughly debunked for reasons I'll describe in a second. But at least one modern school of thought still adheres to the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value is very simple, and it is, unfortunately, kind of how we, kind of growing up as kids, intuitively think about value. The way value actually works in the economy is counterintuitive, unfortunately. The labor theory of value, very simply, is that the value of a given good or service should be directly proportional to the amount and the value of the labor put into that service, okay? As a kind of cutesy little example, let's say I hire Gabriel to plant a tree in my front yard. And it takes Gabriel, abstract away the cost of the tree and whatever, abstract away capital costs. It takes Gabriel an hour to dig the hole and plant the tree. And Gabriel, because of his experience, etc., says that his labor is worth a specific price. Let's say it's $10 an hour. Again, I'm just doing this as a cutesy example. That means, therefore, that I should be able to pay Gabriel $10 for that service because the value of his labor was $10. Therefore, the service should cost $10. Now, as a brief aside, some Marxists have tried to deal with this by trying to kind of mathematically describe how we derive that specific price. I'm skipping over that a little bit just because it gets into the weeds and is not super helpful for the overall discussion because it doesn't actually really weigh on many of the specific critiques of the labor theory of value. Now, the labor theory of value was discredited with the advent of a few schools of thought not long thereafter. And actually, the Austrian school was one of the first to kind of push this theory with a few economists named Eugene von Bauwerk, Karl Minger, and a few others. And what they instantiated is often in economics, this is in the late 19th century now, fast forward to like the 1870s and 1880s, is what is now called the marginal revolution, where they came up with what's called the subjective theory of value. And the subjective theory of value is the theory of value upon which every other economic school of thought besides the Marxist school of thought is predicated. And basically every economist switched to the subjective theory of value because it seems to more accurately describe the world. The subjective theory of value is also very simple. The subjective theory of value simply states that the value of a given good or service is completely subjective depending on the individual utility function of the individual in question purchasing that good or service, okay? So we'll do another cutesy example, and the easiest field to do these examples from is art, actually, to describe the differences here. And even just describing an example, you should immediately see how and why the labor theory of value is wrong and subjective theory of value is correct. Let's say I ask Gabriel to draw me that poster that's behind him from this wonderful show called Berserk. And Gabriel draws me that photo, draws me that picture there. Let's say it takes Gabriel 5 hours, and Gabriel's value of his labor per hour is $10, okay? That means the final cost of that poster under the labor theory of value should be $50. However, I subjectively value it at $100, and I think that is how much it is worth to me, okay? So I instead buy it from Gabriel for $100. Now, this comports much more closely with the subjective theory of value, where we see things in the world all the time where it is simply impossible to derive the current existing market clearing price from the amount of labor put into it, okay? And this is because value is inherently subjective to the individual. Now, the way we derive market clearing prices, which is just the price at which stuff currently sells on the market, is by a system wherein buyers and sellers are kind of bidding with one another in an abstract way, and I'm oversimplifying drastically, to buy a specific good. So you have what's called diminishing marginal utility. That's the crux of why marginal utility, why the subjective theory of value, is more accurate of a description of the world than labor theory of value. I have another example for this that will make this even clearer. Let's say you are dying of thirst in the desert, okay? You've been out there for a day, you haven't had a drop of water in a day, it's swelteringly hot, you feel like you're about to literally die from thirst. And you come across a trader. That trader has a refrigerated cart full of bottles of water. Now, you would probably, if I had to guess, because you're super thirsty, be willing to pay almost any amount for that water. So let's say you have $100 on you. And that water salesman says, all right, I will sell you a bottle of water for $50. Well, you are going to be perfectly willing to spend that because you have a very high subjective value of water given your specific circumstances at that time, okay? So you buy that first bottle for $50, it quenches your thirst. Now, you go back to him and say you want another bottle of water. And he says, well, that'll be another $50. Well, at that point, you might not be willing to pay the $50 because let's say it was a gallon of water rather than a bottle. You've quenched your thirst for a while. Your subjective value of that specific bottle of water has now decreased. Every subsequent bottle of water you'd be willing to pay, or gallon of water you'd be willing to pay a little bit less for because you subjectively value it less, okay? Now, labor theory of value would say you should pay the exact same amount for the first bottle of water as you would for the 50th gallon of water, right? Which intuitively immediately doesn't make sense. Why, if you don't need it and don't value it that highly, why would you continue paying $50 a gallon for water when you've already quenched your thirst? Of course you're not going to do that because that would be irrational. And that would not fit with your subjective utility function. So we have this concept of diminishing marginal utility where each additional unit of a given good or service is less valuable to you subjectively than the previous good. So when you combine this subjective theory of value, that value is subjective depending on individual preference, individual utility is the term of art and economics. And you can just think of the term utility in this case as like subjective preference, right? Utility is literally like how much value am I going to get from this thing? How much do I value it? That diminishes with each additional unit of a given good or service. And it is through the complex process of many individuals both supplying and purchasing a given good, all in drastically different circumstances, how we end up with a market clearing price for a given good. So let me pause there. This is foundational to basically all schools of economic thought, and it's why the implications of this are far, far reaching, right? Because the summation of all utility functions is how we end up with a supply and demand curve for a specific good. If you're under the labor theory of value, none of that works. Modern economics doesn't work. And we can also see this with a bunch. There's a bunch of kind of cool experiments about this. So economists have done like Robinson Crusoe style experiments where they set up little mock economies amongst like 5 people, and they abandon the labor theory of value basically immediately and adopt the subjective theory of value without being told to by the economists. Right? They come to market clearing prices for specific things based on their each individual subjective preference. And again, and I'll pause with this. I might be willing to pay $100 for that Berserk poster because I love Berserk. My wife, on the other hand, has never even heard of that show and would think it's weird if she watched it. She would not pay any amount of money for that poster. Gabriel could try to sell it to her for $1, and she's not going to buy it because she doesn't care. She doesn't want it. Whereas I would be willing to pay $100 for it because I think it's a really cool poster, and I love that show. So subjective theory of value is what explains basically all phenomena we see we observe in the economy with its current institutional structure. And I'll pause there, Gabriel. We can take this kind of any direction you want. And explore this topic further or move to something else.
Yeah. This is such a strangely challenging subject because of how a lot of the language gets confused. Because if you said what you had said to a Marxist, probably the first response they would give you is, wait a second, your utility and subjective version of value is describing prices. But when I say labor theory of value from the Marxist perspective, I'm not talking about prices, I'm talking about the intrinsic objective value of something. And so they like to make this distinction. And that makes it so much more confusing because, like, what is that value? How do you even measure that? And for them, of course, the measurement is labor. But it's such a weird, challenging, slippery subject. And when I've taken the time to read Marxists on this and watch their videos, listen to speakers like I believe his name is Richard Wolff. He's one of the most popular Marxist economists at the moment. They make it very clear that they're not really arguing about a description of how prices function in an economy, that the subjective utility version is probably the correct description of how prices function, but they're arguing that there's some sort of way to describe the true or intrinsic value using labor. And what I've noticed is that they often almost accidentally step away from the positive parts of economics and start stepping into a normative sort of political philosophy type claim. Because this labor theory of value for them is a necessary part of understanding their exploitation theory. Right? So Marxist exploitation theory...
Yeah, but say please dive into that because I just skipped right over it because it's very normative, but it ties in quite nicely. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's such a necessary part of understanding Marxism. So they believe that the worker is being exploited, and the worker is being exploited because the capitalist is extracting the excess surplus value of what is produced, and that value is being measured by the labor that's put in. So an example might be... you've hired me to produce a poster. I've put in a certain amount of labor into that poster, and we're, from the Marxist perspective, assuming that that labor has some sort of objective worth or some sort of objective value. You've then taken this poster and you resell it to go get an extra $100. And their argument is that because you were able to profit off of that, you've actually skimmed some of the value that I own as the worker. I've put in labor, I deserve X amount of money based off of the labor that I've put in, and if I'm not receiving that, then there must be some sort of scheme going on that's manipulating me and taking and exploiting me.
Yeah, and to give that a numerical color and then continue, Gabriel, because I find numerical examples for this are really helpful. Let's again say I'm the capitalist here, and I have hired Gabriel to make me the poster, okay? And I am selling it to a third party. It takes Gabriel 5 hours again. He's charging $10 an hour, so Gabriel's labor cost, let's say we've determined, is $50. Well, I sell the poster for $100 to another third party, and I pocket the $50 profit and pay Gabriel, or $60 profit, let's say, and I pay Gabriel only $40 for that. If that's the case, then any extra dollar that I made when I sold that poster is in fact exploitation and is air quotes stealing from Gabriel the value of that poster, right? So maybe a better example would be it takes Gabriel. Gabriel charges me $10 an hour. Takes him 5 hours to make the poster, $50, and I sell it for $60. Well, if that's the case, and I pay Gabriel anything under $50, I have exploited him. And further, the extra $10 I got from that is also exploitation and should have gone to Gabriel because I did not have any hand in making the poster, right? I just found a guy to buy it and sold it. So I find applying numbers to these things can be quite helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, and the more you dive into how Marxists think about this work, the more confusing it gets. Marx himself never uses the term labor theory of value. I'm not sure if you know this, but it never shows up. It never shows up in Das Kapital. He says things like the law of value, and he talks about labor, and obviously you can interpret it as a labor theory of value, but he never actually uses the term. And the further you get in his works and the further he tries to describe value, he starts adding all these things that ironically gets it closer and closer to like utility theory. So he'll say, well, it's not all labor, it's socially necessary labor, right? And what could that mean other than subjective value? And he'll say like, well, it's not just the labor the worker's putting in, but also all the labor that's going into supporting him. The person who made his boots and so on and so forth. And they add all Marx, and then therefore also the Marxists, add all these extra layers that makes it so complicated that it's almost useless. It seems that the only reason they seem to latch on to this theory of value is not because they have a coherent explanation of how value works and they can describe metaphysically what value is as a concept, but simply because it justifies their exploitation theory. It often comes off as this very retroactive explanation of what's going on. And I'm under the impression that every attempt to say like, well, we're not talking about prices, we're talking about value, and true value is this sort of thing, I'm starting to wonder if it is more of a magic trick than it is actual economics. And again, it seems to step into normative and not positive. So it's really not necessarily economics. It's political philosophy. It's an attempt to describe what people deserve instead of describing how value functions in the economy.
Right, and this brings us back to my initial point, which is that economics is the positive study of human action, right? It is the objective study of what we see, how we see humans interacting with one another. To make Gabriel's point a little further, and then we can move on from the discussion of Marxism to maybe overview a few more of the schools of thought and some other stuff that we cover in the course. There's an underlying problem here, which is that they do an underlying normative bait and switch at the root of this to justify their exploitation theory, which is very simple. They compute, and they come up with kind of complicated ways to do this, the intrinsic inherent value of labor, right? But that is fundamentally a normative statement. They are saying, I believe, and sometimes they'll wrap this in, and they'll attempt to math it, right? They'll attempt to wrap this in an equation or something. They'll say, I believe this person's labor is worth X based on this justification, right? But that is inherently a normative claim. The value of labor, very specifically in the Marxist labor theory of value, is a normative claim about how much labor should be worth. And you can try to justify that normative claim in a variety of different ways, but it's not a positive science. It's not a positive view of the world. The way every other school of economics approaches this, and why the marginal revolution happened, and why every other school of economics and every modern economist uses subjective theory of value and diminishing marginal utility in their analyses, is because those things much more accurately describe the behavior of humans in the world. They more accurately describe human action. So just to put a finer point on what Gabriel's saying, the root of the Marxist claim and the problem there is that at the end of the day, they make a normative claim and then scaffold an attempted economic theory over an underlying foundational normative claim.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an attempt to do political philosophy, but claiming it is economics. Which, of course, ironically, many Marxists, their critique of contemporary economics is that they see it as that. They see it as, oh, these neoliberals are just using economics to justify their political philosophy. And they're sneaking in their pro-capitalist ideas. But Marxism is necessarily doing exactly that. It is not just economics, it's political economy and political philosophy. And so even thinking about Marxist economics as economics is already kind of a challenge, because if we understand economics as a positive, descriptive science, then Marxism, or at least only parts of Marxist economics, can be described as economics. Much of it is beyond that.
That's exactly right. And let me shift gears a little bit now, Gabriel, if you don't mind. I want to bring up one other thing, and then we can either close the discussion or segue to one or two other points on economics, if you like. Totally up to you. Is there's a part of economics that gives you a deep and profound appreciation of how kind of magical and amazing it is that anything ever gets done, that anything ever gets made in the world because of the complexity. There's this great economist that I encourage you all to read, and in fact, there's a page in my course that is simply just a series of excerpts from this particular economist named Friedrich Hayek, and he has this great paper. This paper won the Nobel Prize. This is amazing. So this paper won the Nobel Prize. It's less than 40 pages long, and it has no math in it. For context, I dare you to go look at any current economics academic journal. Every single paper is going to have some of the most complicated algebra that you've ever seen in it. Incredibly complex math. So this is just a side point. One of the many reasons I love this paper. It's one of the few academic papers that transformed a field that you as a layperson can go read and immediately understand. There's no technical jargon in it whatsoever. And what Hayek points out in the use of knowledge in society is that it's kind of unbelievable that we are able to produce anything at all because of how complex it is and how difficult it is to do that, okay? And instead of kind of explaining this myself, if you'll give me just a moment, Gabriel, I want to read an excerpt from the use of knowledge in society so that I can hopefully inspire our audience to be as kind of amazed by this as I am. This thing I'm about to read you is actually what got me excited about economics, because I find this so fascinating and so intriguing and, again, almost magical. So this is a quote from the course written by me, and then I'll tell you when Hayek is speaking.
Yeah, go ahead.
How in the world is it that hundreds of thousands of people all over the world can spontaneously, almost miraculously, coordinate to produce exactly the right quantity of exactly the right product at exactly the right time, such that it results in a product as complex as an iPhone 14? If you think about this deeply, this is an abject miracle on a nearly biblical scale, from pulling the raw earth materials out of the ground to shipping them to the right production facilities, to the hyper-specialized and incredibly complex engineering and industrial processes needed to transform those rare earth metals into the specific components of the iPhone, to combining them in precisely the right way, to literal electron-level precision, at least for the new Apple Silicon chips, to shipping those all over the world, to the iPhone arriving at your front doorstep. Literally hundreds of thousands of people, thousands of companies, and millions of indirectly involved groups and people, all coordinated perfectly to complete that iPhone and sell it to you at the exact price you and Apple agreed upon. And furthermore, Apple makes a profit on each unit sold after all of this coordination. In the use of knowledge in society, Hayek explains this problem succinctly. Now, this is Hayek speaking. The peculiar character of the problem of a rational economic order is determined precisely by the fact that the knowledge of the circumstances of which we must make use never exists in concentrated or integrated form, but solely as the dispersed bits of incomplete and frequently contradictory information which all the separate individuals possess. The economic problem of society is thus not merely a problem of how to allocate, quote, given resources, if, quote, given is taken to mean given to a single mind which deliberately solves the problem set by these data. It is rather a problem of how to secure the best use of resources known to any of the members of society for ends whose relative importance only those individuals know. Or, to put it more briefly, it is a problem of the utilization of knowledge which is not given to anyone in its totality. The sort of knowledge with which I have been concerned is knowledge of the kind which by its nature cannot enter into statistics and therefore cannot be conveyed to any central authority in a statistical form. The statistics which such a central authority would have to use would have to be arrived at precisely by abstracting from minor differences between the things, by lumping together, as resources of one kind, items which differ as regards location, quality, and other particulars in a way which may be very significant for the specific decision. So I'll read you kind of one more little section of Hayek, and then we can move on. And again, I'm doing this in part because this is what inspired me to study economics, to be honest with you. Here's Hayek again. Fundamentally, in a system in which the knowledge of the relevant facts is dispersed among many people, prices can act to coordinate the separate actions of different people in the same way as subjective values helps the individual to coordinate the parts of his plan. It is worth contemplating for a moment a very simple and commonplace instance of the action of the price system to see what precisely it accomplishes. Assume that somewhere in the world a new opportunity for the use of some raw material, say tin, has arisen, or that one of the sources of supply of tin has been eliminated. It does not matter for our purpose, and it is very significant that it does not matter, which of these two causes has made the tin more scarce. All that the users of tin need to know is that some of the tin they use to consume is now more profitably employed elsewhere, and that, in consequence, they must economize tin. There is no need for the great majority of them even to know where the more urgent need has arisen, or in favor of what other needs they ought to husband the supply. If only some of them know directly of the new demand and switch resources over to it, and if the people who are aware of the new gap thus created in turn fill it in from still other sources, this effect will rapidly spread throughout the whole economic system and influence not only all the uses of tin, but also those of its substitutes and the substitutes of those substitutes, the supply of all the things made of tin and their substitutes, and so on, and all without the great majority of those instrumental in bringing about these substitutions knowing anything at all about the original cause of these changes. The whole acts as one market, not because any of its members surveyed the whole field, but because their limited individual fields of vision sufficiently overlap so that through many intermediaries, the relevant information is communicated to all who need it. The mere fact that there is one price for any commodity, or rather that local prices are connected in a manner determined by the cost of transport, etc., brings about the solution which, it is just conceptually possible, might have been arrived at by one single mind possessing all the information which is in fact dispersed among all the people involved in the process. I have deliberately used the word marvel to shock the reader out of complacency with which we often take the working of this mechanism for granted. I am convinced that if it were the result of deliberate human design, and if the people guided by the price changes understood that their decisions have significance far beyond their immediate aim, this mechanism would have been acclaimed as one of the greatest triumphs of the human mind. Its misfortune is the double one that it is not the product of human design, and that the people guided by it usually do not know why they are made to do what they do. But those who clamor for, quote, conscious direction, he's referring to, let me pause here. This document was written as a way to debunk socialism and communism. But those who clamor for, quote, conscious direction, and who cannot believe that anything which has evolved without design, and even without our understanding it, should solve problems which we should not be able to solve consciously, should remember this. The problem is precisely how to extend the span of our utilization of resources beyond the span of the control of any one mind, and therefore how to dispense with the need of conscious control, and how to provide inducements which will make the individuals do the socially desirable things without anyone having to tell them what to do. So this is the spontaneous order of the marketplace, coordinated by prices. There is this beautiful paper that we'll link in the description called I Pencil by an economist named Leonard Reed, or Lawrence Reed, doesn't matter, it'll be in the link, that describes this as a kind of an example, which is very simple. He describes the process by which a pencil is made. And as simple as a pencil is, it's a piece of wood with a little tin wrapper with some lead in it, right? And maybe a rubber eraser. So like maybe 4 distinct components. There is not a single human being on planet Earth right now, nor has there ever existed a single human being on planet Earth that knows how to start from nothing but raw wood and raw tin and raw rubber and make a pencil with consistent quality to sell at a market clearing price on the marketplace. There's not one person on Earth that knows how to make a pencil from soup to nuts at scale. It's completely impossible. So I'll kind of leave this topic at that. I am harping on this for so long and really accentuating it because it is also one of the core marvels at economics. It is amazing that anything works at all. And that this system of economics, this system of the coordination of resources, to allocate resources efficiently toward their highest and most socially efficient use, all happens without any central coordination mechanism whatsoever. It is a completely spontaneous order. It is a direct exposition of forces beyond our understanding and control that results time and time again in the creation of value and in the betterment of individual human lives and in the increase of human flourishing through no conscious design whatsoever. I find this to be, again, magical. Marvel is the right word. Hayek puts this correctly, which is that if this were properly appreciated, this would be the single most celebrated thing about human society. And unfortunately, because of its kind of spontaneous nature, it's a bit hard to wrap your mind around. But once you wrap your mind around it, the immensity of this and the accomplishments that it has wrought completely without any central direction is simply mind-blowing. It is what makes the world progress. It is what makes technology progress, and it is what makes each of our individual lives better day in and day out. This spontaneous use and this spontaneous order of scarce resources toward their most socially efficient good without any central direction.
It's beautiful stuff, man. It's powerful. I've always been really inspired by that kind of critique of centralized planning, centralized control. And honestly, man, I'm happy to leave it at that note. We've had a solid hour of conversation. Everyone should go and read that Hayek paper. Everyone should go take your economics course. You'll learn a lot.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. And please give this a like, comment, subscribe to our YouTube channel here, also on Apple Podcasts once we get this up on there. It helps us more than you know to just throw a like on there if you enjoyed this episode. It really boosts us in the algorithm so that more people can learn these things. And if you're interested in learning the details of this, Gabriel and I didn't even cover this, but there's a chapter in the economics course that will help you understand supply and demand and prices in a way that will help you kind of much more readily grasp what's going on in the world around you. We get into supply shocks, demand shocks. We get into those graphs, staying away from math as much as we can, but just showing you kind of how these things work at a concept level that we didn't even get into here on the podcast. So yeah, please like, comment, subscribe, and go sign up for the course on Learn Arena. And thank you all so much. Have a fantastic day.
Hell yeah.